To me, self-awareness is the foundation of mental toughness.
Your mental proficiency and mental toughness, the route to it was 100% physical.
If you are currently comfortable enough in life or doing well enough in life, then I would say my piece would be find something that makes you uncomfortable, that gives you butterflies.
If we're going to say that we're elite, then let's be elite in every category we need to be in to perform under pressure.
So why is it got to be so damn tough?
Welcome to the Toughness Podcast. I'm your host, Paddy Steinfort, and today we have an extra special episode because we've got two of the most badass people that I know on this planet, and they're both laughing and feeling a little weird right now, but that is a legit, honest statement. And in particular, it's an extra special episode because both of these incredible humans are working with different groups in the military, either have direct experience themselves as an operator or as a mental coach like myself. And so I'll start with ladies first. Ceci Craft, Cecilia full name, but everyone just knows her as Ceci or Cece, is the mental performance coach or the head of the mental performance initiative for the Army Green Berets in particular. I met Ceci when she was working and still does consult with the Cleveland Indians back in baseball days. Ceci, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Patty. I'm excited to be on.
I am not as excited as me, but I think you'll get there. And Coleman Ruiz is the other guest. Coleman has an incredible backstory before we even get to what he does nowadays. Coleman, can you tell us a little more about your history as an operator within the armed forces, how long your career was and what you actually did into deployments, etc.?
Short compared to some people, but really, I know we're talking about toughness and some other things, Patty. My life in the military, I always say, started really with wrestling because that combatives background is what seasoned me to this type of environment. And so then 13 years in special operations in the SEAL teams, 4 combat tours, probably 7 or 8 total type of deployments. But the 4 that I always think about are the ones that really delivered the most pressure when you're obviously in the garden spots around the country and you experience some sort of combat action, some worse than others. But that took me until the fall of 2011, and then I got out of the Navy in the fall of 2011.
And then from there, this is when we didn't meet at that point, but you moved into working with high-level teams in other areas, and that's where we did meet in 2015, I think it was, our paths first crossed, when we were both guest speakers for the Philadelphia Eagles during their preseason work. And at that point, you were transferring the knowledge and experience that you had in those high-pressure environments to other people who work in high-pressure environments, arguably not as high pressure because bullets aren't flying, but it's all relative. And so from there, you were working at that point just as a consultant, and now it's crystallized into something more solid. Do you want to share a little more about the mission critical work that you do?
Yeah, all these, Patty, were, I guess like some of our lives, Cece can probably relate to this as well. It's just like accidents. As I mentioned, I got out of the Navy in the fall of 2011. And because I had the sporting background and the instructor background from being in the teams, both a basic training instructor in our Hell Week back in Coronado and then advanced training instructor in Virginia Beach. And I still stayed in touch with people in athletics. And through a friend, I was doing some work with like Division I college athletic teams, and I met some professional coaches. And without a background, even like yours, Patty, or like Cece's with some formal education, I was just reflecting on these experiences in these environments and sharing that with athletes. And obviously they can relate to it. And so at the same time, I was staying very close to our community, the Mission Critical Teams community, through Dr. Preston Klein's research at the time, which is at Wharton. Now we're separate from Wharton. But because that environment is such a collective of people, from astronauts to athletes and everybody in between, special operations firefighters, that deal in environments where your core decision-making is done in 300 seconds or less, which is Preston's doctoral research. I'm not the doctoral research person, but because I stayed in the applied side of the business, so to speak, this kept pulling us into all of these environments, athletic or otherwise. So now in 2020, I have other parts of my life too, but this slice of my life has continued to like bring us back in touch, Patty, meaning me and you and folks like Cece and hundreds of others now with athletics and the mission critical team community in general.
Yeah. Like you say, accidents happen along the way, but these were great accidents because I would hesitate to guess that I wouldn't know half as many people that are super relevant to what we do on this show, and also just that I've learned so much from And the first time we met, I was like, this is really cool. I watched you tell a story about kicking doors in, and the football players were more into that than anything we saw over the whole training camp. But then afterwards, we kept in touch, and I circled back, and I was talking to, I think it was you or maybe Preston, but either way, one of you said we're doing this mission critical team stuff. And so for those listeners who don't know what that actually refers to, I didn't either at the time. I was just like, oh, that's cool. What are you doing? And you described the audience, which you said it's astronauts, heart surgeons, fire department, all of the branches of the military. And you were like, hey, you should come along. And my response was, are you fucking kidding me? All I do is coach athletes, and I'd love to come, but it doesn't feel right. And then you went ahead and said, no. Here's why we think you should come, because this is what a mission critical team does. You spelled out the definition. And by the end of the definition, I'm like, holy shit, you're right. That is kind of what these guys do. Can you share? You do it much better than me. The definition of what a mission critical team is.
So just think about, because of, CC knows this, and again, Preston knows this better than I do, any legitimate research, you have to narrow down what you're talking about, right? So I'll be, as you asked, specific about mission critical teams. 4 to 12 agents or 4 to 12 members. There's a reason in the literature that it's not 3 people, that teams are, in this case, 4 to 12, and that solve rapidly emerging, complex, adaptive problem sets. Complexity in the environment, when you look at literature, simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic have definitions. So we're talking about complex environments that have emergent characteristics that are non-causal, meaning some crazy shit could happen and you couldn't have planned for it. All right, so 4 to 12 agents or 4 to 12 members that work in complex environments that experience a thing called an immersion event. And think of a black hole, Patty, like there's an event horizon. And if you cross the event horizon, it's worse if you try to reverse than if you complete the process. Okay, so those teams deal with environments where you deal with an immersion event where the consequences are catastrophic loss or death. Now, as you mentioned in our conversations years ago, many people initially say, well, my job isn't a death. And when they think catastrophic loss has to be the car blows up or you don't land the plane. No. Catastrophic loss for an athlete can be missing the field goal with 0 seconds on the clock in the Super Bowl, right? Doesn't matter what sport it is. And so the last point to keep in mind is the 4 to 12 members that experience immersion events that work in complex environments that have a potential for catastrophic loss or death. In their core decision, throwing the football, kicking the soccer ball, combat action, landing an airplane on an aircraft carrier, you name it, right? Just go through the list. Your core decision happens at the immersion event in 300 seconds or less. I mean, it's 5 minutes, right? And the reason for the 300 seconds or less is because of the physiology and the neurobiology behind mission critical teams. Essentially, if we were to stop right now, Patty, and just count, we have about 300 seconds of oxygen in our brain to work the physiology of a mission critical problem. And that's why the research is sectioned off that way. So for a listener, if you have a job that requires a decision in 300 seconds or less, that once you cross an immersion event, it's worse to reverse yourself than to keep going, you're essentially an MCT member.
Right. And that for me was like an eye-opening, like kind of brain explosion event. If you think about the emoji with the brain exploding at the top, that's kind of what I would have pictured that day that I look like while you're telling me that, because I will sometimes refer when I'm sitting with an athlete or a coach to a sweaty palms moment, which is the anticipatory, this shit is about, anything could happen right now within reason. And I'm about to step off a threshold and I can't go back. Like the ref has the ball in his hands. He's about to throw it up for the tip-off. Tip-off is at 8 p.m. No, it's not stopping just because I feel nervous. It's not stopping because I didn't prepare properly. It's not stopping for me to calm down. It's just, this is going to happen. And it, for me, was the embodiment of that. I had an experience coming overseas from a different country, seeing the athletes here have absolute reverence for the military, and it's similar back home. And I couldn't work out why. And then your description gave me a little insight into that, is because it's very hard for pro athletes to find other people that go through what they do go through, both physiologically and psychologically. And there was one great example of they share that experience. So I mentioned the sweaty palms moments, my own pretty bad term for that experience for pro athletes, but you worked with the Indians and still do in some capacity, but you were full-time there running that program for how many years? Like you were there a long time, right?
6 years, yeah.
And so over the course of that 6 years, can you share with, like, when you think of a mission critical operator, as Coleman's just described it, like what scenario jumps out to you? The Cleveland Indians looking at an athlete or maybe even a coach where you're like, yeah, that's really where mission critical comes into it from a Major League Baseball player.
I think there are a lot of moments. If you think about every reliever stepping on the field, your best relievers get put in positions where there are men scoring position and they are brought in for a brief period of time, maybe one pitch, maybe to get two guys out, but they're there to strike people out. They have one mission. They know they're coming in for it. They know there's pressure. You certainly can't get off the mound once you're on. You are at the center of a stadium with 40,000 fans, and it's time for you to deliver. And I think that's true even for the starter that in the fifth inning all of a sudden gets a bomb hit off him. And, he's just has given up a 2-run home run and the game's changed momentum. And how is he going to respond? And the ball comes back to his hand and he's got to respond right there. Clearly not the same as life or death, but I think what gets interesting is when you look at some of the physiology, you're seeing very similar physiological states and reactions. The hitter that's stepping up in the bottom of the ninth and wants to bring it home for their team. Those pressure moments exist. I think you're right. We had a great initiative when I was up with the Indians where we brought Special Forces Green Beret families up to throw out a first pitch and hang out with their guys a little bit so that they could tell those stories to each other. And I think for the baseball players, it was pretty amazing perspective. One of the side notes that I also liked for the baseball players was that you could watch a Green Beret get nervous to throw out a first pitch. And it kind of brought home that these amazing soldiers that can tell you about stories and places you'd never want to go, they get nervous too. And they would range walk. They would fast move off that mound after throwing off that pitch. They couldn't wait to get out from the center of that ballpark. And, it gives you appreciation. We all get stressed. We all get nerves. We all get sweaty palms and, it's just handling it and moving forward.
It's one of the rare occurrences where you'll actually get someone's hero who their hero is the person who's the hero. It's almost a reciprocal heroosity or whatever the word is there, because the athletes look up to the soldiers and the soldiers are just so happy to be in the locker room with these athletes that they love. It's a very rare and unique and special thing. You mentioned physiology. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say one of my favorite moments was that the kids of the soldiers very rarely realized that people would look at their father as a hero. And so when the players were saying how much they respected and were thankful for their dad, it was kind of a shocked face on the kid who was getting baseball autographs. But I always loved it. I thought it was the most kind of badass moment of the whole thing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. You both mentioned physiology. I just had an experience of physiology as you were describing that, Cece, where I got little goosebumps. Things happen to us that sometimes we're aware of, sometimes we're not, but particularly under these amazing, unique environments. Like you said, some of them you don't want to go to. I would not want to be in Fallujah. Some of them you do want to go to. Yankee Stadium sounds pretty cool. But they both produce similar physiological events within us. And so let's start with you, Cece, in terms of your work with Major League Baseball players. How do you firstly bring about awareness? It's probably a little bit easier because they're feeling it, but help them gain some sense of control over how to handle that on the biggest stage.
There's a lot of bad information put out about nerves, about physiology, about what you should feel and about how it should look. And so I think one of the biggest things working with pro athletes was normalizing what people would feel and also trying to put out accurate information. So information like butterflies mean you're not ready, or when your mouth goes dry, you should start to panic, or when your hand's shaking, it's because you're a wuss. But in fact, all those physiological components are your body readying itself for a big moment. And they're good. They're all good for you if you don't fight them, if you can accept them, if you understand them. And so I think there's a lot of myths around performance that do athletes injustice or do any performer an injustice. And the other thing I think is people don't tend to talk about them. So I remember a baseball coach looking at me in shock when I told him that I would call pitchers that were going to be brought up to the major leagues. And I would tell them that they might not feel their hands or their feet or their legs during their debut, their major league debut. And he was like, you tell them that? And absolutely, I do, because I don't want them to think that they are wrong or messed up or don't have a right to be on that mound when it happens. And it's going to happen to them. They all describe it in retrospect. So if I can describe that to a player early on, and if he's up on that mound and he's pitching and he goes, I can't feel my hand. Oh, yeah, she told me that was going to happen. No big deal. Keep pitching. Great. We're going to perform through all kinds of uncomfortable states. I think There's this myth that you should feel in the zone. There's this myth that it's going to be a great day. There's a myth that you're going to feel ready. We feel all kinds of things when we perform. And so just creating that acceptance around it. And your job in some ways is to accept where you're currently at and then compete wherever you're currently at with whatever you currently have. And so I think myth busting and then also honest expectation and acceptance.
That is an interesting and very counterintuitive insight that I tried to lead you in a trap there, that you clearly, as a veteran, avoided it, because it's less about, as you're saying there, part of it is like some control strategies and techniques, or like an ability to reroute physiology. But it's not all about control. Some of it is like, this is just what happens to your body when you're doing cool shit, right? Mm-hmm. And Coleman, how much of your work, you mentioned that you were doing the instructor training. How much of that work was in helping people prepare physiologically for stress, as opposed to like, you're going to be badass athletes, tactical athletes, we're going to train you within an inch of your life. But when you started that, let's say, because I know that there's an interesting evolution in that phase, which is where Mission Critical Teams initiative has been so cool to help that evolution. When you started as a training instructor, how much of it was about just becoming very good athletes versus physiologically handling stress?
100% to 0%. 15 years ago as a basic training instructor, 12 years ago in advanced training, Patty, we did not talk about this hardly at all. So 100% of the training was about your, for lack of a better term, bear with me, your mental proficiency and mental toughness, the route to it, and maybe the route to it still was 100% physical. Like the more you could grind and the more you could deliver in the event, it was that being able to deliver in that event. And Ceci knows, like, there is some value in just straight up physically taking that pathway was almost like the signal that you had mental agility or mental toughness or mental proficiency.
It was a war of attrition for you either survived or you didn't, and that was that.
That's it. And the best example, Patty, is like, just go to basic training, right? You come in, at least into our training, wrestlers, swimmers, and water polo players are the highest percentage of graduates in SEAL training. I can give you 5 obvious reasons, right? Over time, they built up the comfort, but they weren't trained in some mental agility. It was like the sport, just like they built up that proficiency. So since probably 2009, 2010 to now, and I'm obviously not on active duty anymore, our relationship with mental agility and mental fitness has come a long way to incorporate the things that Cece was just talking about, which it wasn't even in our curriculum.
And so how did that, you said it's gone from 0 to now it's incorporated it, but it's still physical and rightfully so. At what point did you notice it, either a need for it to change, and then when you actually have tangibly can say that's the point when it started to shift?
Yeah, I'm going to take a stab at when it started to shift, but I'll say right around when I was getting out, 2011 or 12, where our selection and assessment psychologist, that department started to grow with folks like you and Cece, like people who were professionals in mental agility and mental training. That wasn't just a selection and assessment or an off-ramping transition type psychology department, right? Or a checkup from the neck up. So around, just let's call it 2012, I personally got interested, and it's why I'm always nerding out on these topics with you guys, is because in 2008, I think, or 2007, I picked up John Rady's book, Spark, which wasn't even about mental performance, right? It was about the brain really learning and the physiology connection to the brain. Right. It's the first time I ever...
And his work was a lot about children and learning at school, right? It was had nothing to do with Navy SEALs on the surface.
The opening story is about the school in Naperville, Illinois, and learning and the science and technology scores of the kids because they were running a mile every morning to anaerobic threshold, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes, as you know, Patty, chapter by chapter to talk about brain-derived neurotropic factor, the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And I had gotten a small taste of it when I read Dave Grossman's book on combat. And I admit this all the time in the open. I went through Buzz in 1999. I had already had 2 or 3 combat tours under my belt by 2007. And Spark and On Combat, those 2 books, handed to me by a peer, were the first 2 like legitimate pieces of mental agility training I got, other than go harder for longer with more intensity. That was my mental training from the time I was a little kid. Now, it works, but it works until it doesn't, right? So then the shit hits the fan, or you just run out of energy for it, or You have some sort of adrenal burnout and then you're toast and you don't even know what the hell happened to you.
Does the same level of burnout happen? Or, I mean, I've worked in baseball almost as long as you, Cease, but did you notice, given that you've worked prior to baseball, you worked as same role, but for the military, and now you work in a very specialized special operations, like pointy end of the spear stuff. Does the same burnout or war of attrition that you saw on the military front exist in baseball?
I don't think it does quite on the same level. So one of the experiences that I've had that's been really interesting is my first 6 years with the military. I was working within a special forces population, but the people I was around, I was younger, and the people I was around, frankly, were younger. As I've come back into the military, a lot of the people that I got close to when I was there the first time are now retiring. They're getting out and they're much older in their careers and they're broken and they're exhausted and their lives are all at different spots. And actually, Coleman, I just sent a bunch of them the podcast on residue and the one actually on the physiology and psychology of deployments before that, because I wanted them to hear it, to normalize it in the same way I would with an athlete on nerves of, hey, you know, you didn't lose your motivation in a way no one else has, or you're not struggling with this transition in a way that no one else has. And that's such an important message. I think in baseball, the lifespan, frankly, is shorter, the average lifespan for pro baseball. And there's more of a thought of we need to keep this person healthy. There might be a little bit more thoughtfulness on sadly protecting what is very broadcasted as a multi-million-dollar asset. And so I don't think you see the end of the career in the same way. Someone that's jumped out of a plane with heavy weight and landed on those knees and those hips looks pretty beat up at the age of almost 50 or 40 something. If you see some of our older coaches walk on the field, you may notice they're pretty beat up too. I used to joke that 2 of my AAA coaches, I knew amputees that walked better than they did. Their hips were awful from the rotations.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think you do see some of the physiological breakdown, maybe not the psychological breakdown in the same way, but I will say, I think that was something that we talked about as within the Indians too, is how do we support our coaches and their families and all that they're going through, because it's a very unique lifestyle to have someone away from home 8 months out of the year, have them be away from home, have them want to connect with their kids. There's a whole component of general health in both of these domains that frankly, I think we're just probably in the last few years really
scratching the surface in terms of
also say, in my current job, I'm not as cool as you initially described me. I'm the head of the SOSEP program, which is within SWEC, but not every Green Beret. There are amazing people working all throughout the country for Green Berets. So
okay, well, I'll let you have that.
Cool.
I'll let you have that moment of humility, but I'll also probably edit that out. No, I'm joking. I'll leave it there. I like accuracy. One of the things you just mentioned there, which was an absolute eye-opener for me coming into baseball in particular in this country, but specifically baseball as a sport, is like no other in the sense that you're playing pretty much every day. Like you do, there are mandated days off, but when you get on that plane to leave spring training and you go to the first home series or away series, whatever it is, like that's it for 6 months. And it's about, I've always said to people who probably don't know better, because I wouldn't say it to you two, because you do know better, that it's about as close to deployment as you can get. That you leave your family for an extended period. You do get to visit them, so it's definitely not the same. But in terms of being an athlete in America, that's about as close as you can get in terms of that experience. And that, to me, was something I underestimated. Probably the biggest thing for me, biggest learning for me was how important sleep is and how important human connection is. When I first went on the road with the Major League Baseball team I first worked with for 6 weeks in a row, and I was just like, at the end of it, I had no energy to talk to a coach who had no energy. And I was like, wow, I got to look after myself better. But now I get why they didn't want to do those things that I asked them to do 2 weeks ago, because they're experiencing stuff that it's just really hard to comprehend until you do it. And so I'm curious how much for you, Cece, who's been in both camps, how much of that element, the chronic fatigue and the chronic stress, as opposed to that sweaty palms moment, which is where we started, this is a different type of stress that is just always there. Are there some similarities there, or am I way off?
No, I think there are similarities. I definitely would defer to Coleman on the deployment experience, and MCTI did a really good job on, I thought, the podcast on that, which I think a lot of people could relate to in some different fields. You guys even mentioned hospital workers right now, which was, I thought, such a good one. Baseball is a really unique sport in that the grind of every night. And I think it does systematically beat you down. When I first switched from the military to baseball, I remember thinking the schedule is not hard. You guys talk about long days and this is not a long day. Like we start at a very civilized hour. You don't call anyone before 11 a.m. in baseball unless it's spring training. And even if you go till midnight, like that is not a long day compared to military stuff. What does get you, and Patty, you hit the nail on the head, is over time and over years. I used to feel like I stepped on the escalator at the beginning of spring training and I got kicked off of it rudely sometime in October or November. And people would ask me all throughout those months how my life was. And I'd say, well, look at the box scores, because there was no life. And then you started to watch years tick by and kind of think, like there are years going and this is what I'm giving my life to. And how do I feel about that? And I think that's true for the athletes, and they're trying to live lives and have marriages and have kids. I think that's true for soldiers too, without a doubt. But I would defer a lot to Coleman on kind of that comparison point. I mean, you've been around pro athletes and you've experienced deployment.
Yeah, so Coleman, for you on that point, like having experienced it as an operator, but then also trained people to get ready for that and probably receive them back after deployments. And now doing the work you do with Mission Critical, where I know a recent paper was on the residue of post-deployment or post-operation, post-exposure to these environments. What has been your learnings over that period of, I'm just going to get through it as an operator, which is normally most people are just like head down, bum up, like Ceci said. And then you start to realize there's a toll and you start to try and work out ways to manage it. But now you're looking at people who are doing that. What's been the biggest learning for you across that spectrum?
In a really, really practical and tactical sense as well, Pat, is like one of the things working for us, but also against us, is our youth when we're in our deployment peak. Is like, here's the truth, is like you can get away with a hellacious schedule because you can just put out that kind of energy, right? And you have no I'll implicate myself. I have no respect and no recognition for the fact that that we're, as I say a lot now, we're still trapped by the laws of physics. Like this engine inside my skin does not have unlimited capacity. When I'm 27 years old, you could have not told me that. I would have never heard it, because I have evidence every day that I can go at 100 miles per hour nonstop, including deployments and training. Remember, Patty, when it comes to deployments, at least for us, our type of folks that Cease works with, and the training cycle going on deployment was oftentimes a break in a way. It's like that for athletes a lot sometimes too, right? And so the analogy I talk about now is, to get to your point about the learnings, I have a laundry list of learnings, but one to bring up in the context of what we're saying now is that I'm not a private pilot or anything, but somebody listening will know the numbers, or maybe not. We can look it up at some point. Aircraft engines, they get rebuilt and refit a lot more often than car engines, right? The car that you drive, Patty, than I drive, your engine may never get rebuilt, right? And that's because it runs at 3,000-ish RPMs. An aircraft engine runs at whatever it runs. It's not 3,000 RPMs, and those engines need to be rebuilt more often. What we're dealing with, what Cease is dealing with, the folks you're dealing with in professional athletics, we're dealing with aircraft engines. And what I learned was we weren't doing a great job of rebuilding the engine on a regular basis. And for the audience, remember, I try to always make sure I caveat this with my view of this topic is not like, oh, what was me? Like we need more rest. No. The purpose of learning about the system is so that you can run the engine as hot as possible, because that's still your job. I think sometimes we make a mistake. Just wanted to at least close my current answer with this point, is we make a mistake sometimes in like we get post-career or afterwards. And then it's almost just like, oh no, take it easy. Like you shouldn't go so hard. No, go hard. But we need to figure out how to refit the engine properly to go hard when it needs to, and I wasn't doing that. All my peers, we were just hot on the gas 24/7, 365.
I think one of the pieces that started to make sense in my mind is if you see some of the amazing sports cars that some of these baseball players get to drive around, you'll notice that oftentimes the brakes are like bright red on them. They'll highlight the brakes on the vehicle. Well, why? Because if you're going to drive a sports car that can drive 200 plus miles an hour, it's got to have a damn good brake system. You don't want to drive a car that fast that doesn't have a good brake system. That would be a terrible idea. But I started to realize with soldiers, and I definitely realized with the better people in baseball, I wasn't necessarily there to help them learn how to press the gas. They were really good at pressing the gas. They really sucked at their brakes and their first gear. They just had no clue. Like they lost the ability to use those first 3 gears. And so they'd be running in 5th and 6th gear everywhere they went, and they'd hit a wall or break an ankle or tear a labrum. And it was catastrophic versus just saying, hey, we're going to take a second. We're going to drop gears for a little bit. We're going to pull out of this. We're going to be fine. And you're going to hit 5th and 6th again. It's going to be okay. But it was relearning to walk with someone that had only been running. And that was this really essential skill. And so to Coleman's point, I think it's a great one. The point of the brakes is so that you can corner and drive fast and have fun. It's not to stay in first gear all the time. That's not what we're recommending, but you have to know how to use those other gears to then throw it into 6th.
I love that analogy, and I'll extend it one extra bit, is particularly with the current circumstances for athletes at least, and I'm assuming for some military, is neutral is a pretty important gear as well. We need to get used to being able to sit in neutral and just wait. Sometimes neutral is used as a brake, right? I was amazed when my mum told me that while I was driving lessons, but being able to sit still and wait and not have that push us into red or just turn the engine off is sometimes just as important. I'm struck by the examples you used there, Ceci, and the fact that you've been in both camps, obviously super helpful, but that particularly in my experiences as a pro athlete from the age of 17 to 26, was very similar, I think, to as you were describing your experience there, Coleman, in the sense of it was 100 and it was always 100. And it was 100 when we were playing and training and drinking and traveling. And this was like how you accrued credit points in the locker room, right? You train hard, but you play hard. And this is just like at the age of 22, it didn't matter. Nowadays, it might take me probably a month to get over one of the nights we used to have or a week of training. And that was the definition of toughness, particularly in Australian football, but I think just in general in pro sports and in society, like toughness was being hard and being maximum and just going like that. Coleman, you've used the word agility a few times, and that's not a common word used in, I guess, a young person's understanding. Would 20-year-old you as an operator have talked about mental agility as part of toughness, or is that something you've come to learn over the time?
It's something I've come to learn over the time. However, Patty, I think we can jump the gap or explain it a little bit better. And I'll use like the obstacle course example in our training or any training. If you're lined up with, let's say you're in your basic training class and you're lined up with 100 guys, all separated by 90 seconds on the obstacle course. And so you're watching people go in front of you and everything is about how good your time is and are you doing a good job and whatever, right? And you're watching a guy in front of you and he's just ripping through the obstacle course. You're like, that dude's agility and power is incredible. And the guy's agility and power is incredible. And what we don't say, though, is we don't recognize later that this person's, his or her physical agility, there's an equivalent game to be played in mental agility. Or not even game, there's an equivalent level of skills to be learned in mental agility. Because as we talk about a lot, Cease, with like, at least I do with athletes, is my guess with, use basketball analogy, my guess is if LeBron James or Steph Curry wins a championship and they sit down at the press conference and the press conference folks ask them, what did your team do to win this championship in tight circumstances or whatever? They don't typically say that we shot the basketball really straight. They don't typically say a physical thing. And the reason is, and just like a soldier won't tell you why their combat deployment was successful, is not because we shoot our weapons really straight. That's why it was successful. No. They're going to tell you something about the training, the perseverance, the adaptability, the agility of the team, which is an indicator of their mental capacity for work and that mental agility, Patty. And if someone had just told me, said mental agility back in the day, I wouldn't have listened to it in the same way. My point is, like telling the obstacle course story, is we have how much we respect physical agility, but we hesitate to respect mental agility in the same way or train for it in the same way. But we all know, based on research and where we are in 2020, that when you're really pressured way out on the edge of your physical ability, the only thing you have left, the only gear you can go into is a mental one. And so what I share with our teams all the time is, if we're going to say that we're elite, then let's be elite in every category we need to be in to perform under pressure. Otherwise, don't say you're elite.
My first boss working for the military, named Mike Larreri, who's a retired lieutenant colonel, still is, he would do a whiteboard exercise that I loved. And he would throw up agility, flexibility, power, strength, endurance. And he would say, okay, physically, how do we define each of these? No issue. How do we train each of these? No issue. Mental. same 5. How do we define these? And people would work out how to define it. What's mental flexibility? What's mental agility? Okay, people can start to work through these. How do we train them? And you think, well, okay, do you want these skills? Yeah, absolutely. We want these skills. Like, we need to be mentally flexible. We need to be agile. Okay, but we're not training them. So why do we think we should have them? And I think that's one of those pieces that we miss on the mental side, right? Like, we know physical gifts, some of them we're born with, or genetic or God-given, and some of them we have to work really hard to acquire. But we know to sustain them at a high level, we have to put in work. But like, I've joked with a lot of people that teach them the graduate programs for mental performance. Like, none of us got issued fairy wands or fairy dust at the end of our graduate programs to do mental performance. Like, I don't have anything that's going to give it to you after that. You're going to have to work at it. I think the challenge for our field sometimes is, hey, how do we tangibly create the training for you to work on it and make this something you understand that you are building and that you understand you're going to have to work at to build?
In terms of what you just mentioned there, Ceci, like the ability to train some of these things, it's kind of a given in terms of mental endurance, right? Let's just do something that's mentally taxing for a long time. Cool. But mental agility, how have you found the best way, whether it's in pro sports or with tactical athletes? How do you go about improving someone's mental agility?
I think context is incredibly relevant, right? Ken Ruiz would have said context. He probably would have used it in a slightly different way. But I think that's important too. One of the areas that you're going to work a lot with in the military on the mental side oftentimes is memory, which is not as necessarily essential in sport. But that's a huge piece of cognitively what's oftentimes getting processed, along with the ability to exert adrenaline, keep going, carry weight, yada, yada. But we know things like, for example, for working memory, the training out of context doesn't always transfer very well. So if you're going to be working with soldiers where facial recognition is important, or remembering license plates or numbers or things like that, context matters. And so I think when you look at mental agility, one of the pieces that's really interesting on the mental side is you have to understand the context for that performer, whether that's an athlete or a soldier. And then you're going to build within that context to help them create agility. So if their job is going to demand that they are switching focuses, or that they're able to ignore a distraction and listen in on something else, build within those contexts. And ideally, just like in sport, I think mental performance, if you can do it on a baseball field when it's applicable, is oftentimes better for the athlete, better for you than being in an office. I think that's true for soldiers too, right? The more you can get within their normal training domains, the better it is. When you find yourself in a sterile office, you're doing a lot of trying to replicate or a lot of trying to build a scene to create generalization from that training to wherever you want it to go. Yeah.
And also I remember being impressed when I was first talking to you guys about some of that element of like, let's try and put them in context, right? That you talked about an exercise you did. I'm pretty sure it was you. Hopefully it is. Otherwise, this story's going nowhere. But you had guys get into a physiological state on the mound, and then you would actually talk them through the process of getting down from 9 to a 7, right? Is that?
Yeah. You may have talked to multiple people about it. I'm sure we're not the only ones. But I think if you can get people in their performance state and talk about it, I think that's an area where working with their instructors, cadre, or coach becomes a really big deal too, right? If your pitching coach is part of that, is noticing things, and oftentimes they'll notice it faster than I will, and they're able to talk that piece. Hey, remember, this is where we talked about finding a visual cue. Hey, this is where we talked about a breath. Hey, this is where we talked about a reset button. I think that's absolutely huge in terms of the ability to learn it and put it into context for where you actually need it. And if you look at the military settings, like what's so amazing is oftentimes they've talked, like when you put it in special forces terms, when you talk to a team sergeant, right, the guy that's been around and is running a team, you'll describe something and he'll be like, oh, we do imagery, we call it this, or like that's a rock drill. We talk about self-talk or cues, we just do it this way. They have things that they have done that are well-honed, incredibly smart mental performance skills or assets. They don't always have the language to relate them to the younger guys, and they don't always remember to relate them to the younger guys because for them, it's common sense at this point. Of course, I go through this procedure. I think where we fail is to deliberately realize, hey, this is a really essential component to your success, and to remember to talk it to the novice. Again, I think true on the pitcher, the first time you're teaching him that he can actually downregulate. For the guy that's behind a gun, the first time learning he can downregulate or that he can regulate, period. Sometimes those lessons are passed really well sometimes we forget to pass them.
And you mentioned the expert's dilemma there. And I see this sometimes in a veteran player talking to a rookie, right? They're trying to tell them this thing, but like it makes sense. And they're like, I remember the first time I saw this was in cricket. So for those of you not familiar with cricket, I usually describe it as the rest of the world's baseball. And they're talking about a certain type of delivery, so a certain type of pitch they might want to throw. And in particular, in cricket, they throw the ball it hits the ground before it gets to the batter. And if you make it bounce just in front of the person's toes, it makes it very hard to hit, you can imagine, right? So that's called a Yorker, or up in the block hole, where this is the thing. Trying to dig into that as an example, like, so can you tell us what the block hole, like, what do you mean when you said block hole? And the guy was like, well, it's the block hole. Like, there's no other way to define it. It's just like that. It's just the block hole. What are you talking about? And for veterans talking to rookies, or for leaders or coaches talking to new recruits, like, it's often a spelling block of, there's this thing that we know what it is, and come on, you've got to know, and we can't even put words. And so that question can go a couple of ways that I'm going to throw it to you, Coleman, where it's either one, you've used the term mental agility, which is great. I didn't have to introduce it, but have you either seen what's the best activity you've seen in the military context? You're like, that's the way military can train that. Or what's an example that you've seen in terms of describing these different components of mental fitness that the language just wasn't there until you perhaps worked your way around it or found a native way of saying it?
Yeah, what you just described, Patty, was the tacit knowledge transfer problem. You know how to ride a bike, but you can't necessarily describe how to ride a bike. Most people will just say, Patty, tell me how to ride a bike. You'll say, get on and pedal, for the most part. You might say something about balance and proprioception, or who knows, right? And you're going to want to ask Preston about this, and then hit pause. You'll ask Preston about tacit knowledge transfer, then hit mute on your mic and just let him go. But there's a couple different ways. You hit a couple, Ceci already hit a couple, and one that was jumping to mind when you guys were talking was all these other examples about different types of mental performance. And one, context obviously matters. And just telling somebody, this sounds ridiculous, but for years in my career in special operations from 99 until till roughly 2006, I don't know that I ever had an instructor say, this training is for this mental skill. We just did training. And as Cece mentioned, I realized later that I picked up a bunch of mental skills that I could translate, but that's highly dependent, Patty, as you know, on like your learning style, your capacity for learning, all the way down to like, are you a note taker? So when you do 4, 5, 6 free fall jumps in a day out at a drop zone, you may be out for 3 weeks and you're going to do 40, 50, 60 jumps in 3 weeks. Are you keeping a jump log on what you did? Because if an instructor or the system isn't set up to simply just tell you high altitude, low opening, which is roughly speaking in the daytime, jump at 13,000 feet, open at 4,000 feet, fly your canopy in to the drop zone in the daytime, right? That's a certain set of skills, because obviously if you jump out of an aircraft at 13,000 feet and you pull at 4,000, you have less time to make decisions, right? A high altitude, high opening jump at nighttime at 25,000 feet, different things can go wrong. But when you jump at 25,000 feet, if you have a mistake early in the jump, you're working with 20,000 feet of airspace to make a decision, right? That's a completely different set of skills, but you have other options, right? And so number one, I think in our context, particularly for young operators doing something really high risky and is high risk training, is being clear about what you're training on, like in given event, right? Because as you guys know, as professionals in this space, you can stress somebody and you learn something, or you can teach somebody. You cannot do both at the same time. People can argue this all day long, but you guys know the physiology better than I do. You have to choose one of those, and you learn different things in those environments, right? So just saying that would have been useful to me. Like, it would have been useful, Patty, if an instructor had said, Coleman, for the next 6 hours, or let's just use Hell Week, for 5 days straight, we're just going to smash your head in. That's what this training is for. Just smashing you. You're not going to learn anything. Be like, okay, no problem. But I didn't think in Hell Week I was learning anything useful. I just knew it was a test, right? But you get my point. And then the only other one I want to mention in terms of when I learned that learning something about mental agility, like how to set it up, was, as you mentioned, where we, I think in special operations and military, stumble our way into help solve the tacit knowledge transfer problem, is our very deliberate after action review process that even though we don't like to talk about stuff out loud in front of each other, and I think it's actually worse in locker rooms, Patty, is a lot less open assessing of your performance in locker rooms. We do a decent job of that. We're not always kind and gentle with each other, and I don't really think in those environments we should be. We have to get down to the brass tacks. But even by accident, that activity builds a shared language that helps you describe the block hole problem when it's hard to describe decision-making and pressure if you don't have a normalized or shared language to use the same words.
Yeah. You mentioned something there about specifically, I picked up on you talking about the intent of here's why we're doing this drill, here's why we're going to bash you in the face for 5 days. And it immediately made me think of, as a 17-year-old, so one of the scars, a few scars from my football career, but there's 3 of them on my shoulder from 3 separate shoulder reconstructions over the course of 6 years. And part of it is because when I was trained as a 17-year-old, they just put me on the bench press and said that it was purely outcome, just press that weight. And you've got to catch up to these 24-year-olds and you got to do it quick. And so my shoulder mechanics were horrendous and I would like curl around and just do whatever I could to get it up there without knowing that actually part of the training is supposed to be setting your scapula so that you can be solid and move the weight more efficiently. And so by the time we worked that out, it was too late. My shoulders were pretty screwed up. But it's a great example of it. If someone had told me early on, here's what we're trying to do with this exercise, here's what you need to pay attention to while you're doing the exercise, it's a totally different learning outcome in a physical sense, but you're talking the same stuff emotionally as well. Ceci, Coleman just mentioned there the after-action review, and when I'll circle back to you in a second, Coleman, he mentioned also a jump log, right? And I've seen hitters come back to the dugout and that they will write down every pitch. It's a rarity, but it does happen. And they will be like, here's what happened, here's what he threw me, here's what I did, here's how many runners were on and score and all that sort of stuff. But also there are some who take it to the next level and they're like, here's what I felt, here's what I was paying attention to. And it becomes a self-learning tool as opposed to I'm just trying to learn about the pitcher. Is there a review process you've seen either from someone who's really good at baseball or perhaps even a good manager who helped their team reflect that stands out to you as like, given that you also have seen good after-action reviews military-wise? What stood out to you in baseball as like, that was a really cool way to do it?
I think I was shocked when I first got into baseball and it took me some time to appreciate that they didn't do an after action review of some kind every night. I was going back from 3 a.m. or you'll finish a training with them at 2 a.m. and they'll be like, all right, we are in an hour. And you're kind of thinking, holy hell, it's going to be 3 a.m. Okay. But they after action review everything. And it's very candid.
I think I was actually with you guys when I was with the Eagles. We came and visited Akron. And I was in the dugout.
Yes.
And we were talking about the starting pitcher just got whacked. He came off and everyone just kind of avoided him because he had screwed up and probably cost them the game. And just no one talked to him. And both myself and my colleague from the Eagles were looking at you being like, but wait, don't you need to help the guy? Like he's in a bad spot right now. You ought to help him feel better at the very least or help him learn. And it was like, nah, it's kind of not what you do in baseball.
Yeah, baseball, you leave them be for a while. And depending on who it is, it might be the next day, it might be later that night. It's always interesting. But
there's an element of that thing that if they play every night, it becomes exhausting to do that all the time for them.
Yeah, and it's just culturally different. I think the older players in baseball would tell you that they used to sit around clubhouses and have beers after the game, and they used to do a debrief, an informal debrief, and they used to talk about how the guy pitched that night and who had success and what did they see and how did it work. And I think they would tell you that some of that's missing in baseball is that guys tend to clean up, shower, get out of the clubhouse nowadays. And the culture is shifting. They don't sit around the same way. And I think there's probably truth there. But I do think your best players are really reflective on their performance. And I think journaling is huge. No one loves to talk about it, but sniper journals. There are badass people that journal.
Didn't say that again. Sorry, you say sniper journals.
Sniper journals.
Those two words in the same breath.
Coleman can elaborate probably way better than I can, but every bullet that has gone, every round that has gone through that rifle has been journaled. They know exactly how many rounds have gone through the barrel of that gun because they want to know how the gun shoots when it's cold. They want to know how it shoots when it's warmed up. They want to know they call it dope, all the data on it. So Coleman can talk way more about that than I can. But yeah, they journal. They know everything about how they perform. They better. I
actually am super curious to hear more about that. And you gave a couple of great examples of like just learning about the instrument we're using. A little similar to the human who's the extremely neurotic, conscientious hitter that I was referring to. I won't name them. that they would log time, date, innings, score, runners in position, picture how many innings they had, what their normal mix was. Here's what he gave me. Here's what I did. But here's what I felt. And here's what I was playing. Like he went into learning his own instrument. This is a great example for some military folk. It may sound like, yeah, this is what we do. But for those who aren't military or aren't snipers and may not know about this, can you tell us a bit more about what that looks like? Cool.
It's funny, since you brought that up, because in 99, when I checked into SEAL Team 3, I had a gap in picking up my first platoon. And officers don't serve as snipers ultimately, but I went to sniper school with the rest of this big group. There was an open billet. It was an opportunity to go and understand the craft. I was never going to obviously serve as like a platoon sniper, but I graduated from sniper school in late 1999 or 2000. I can't remember now, but what C's described is exactly true. So you record every bullet through the gun. You record humidity, temperature, wind, who your shooting buddy is, what drill you're doing for obvious reasons. Are you shooting a known distance target? Are you shooting an unknown distance target? Because there's a way to get distance on a target where you don't know how far away is using this process called MILS. And you have to know everything about the environment, Patty, because the bullet behaves differently depending on how hot it is, how humid it is, what elevation you're at, et cetera, et cetera. Dive logs are the same way. Temperature of the water, what's the current, what's the everything. Jump logs are the same way. Where did you jump? What was the altitude? Who was around you? All these different things. And so when it comes to, these are things we don't often, I'm glad this got brought up because we don't often get into this kind of thing, because in the general conversation of like performance today and everywhere, it's always, oh, use the 5-minute journal or write the 3 things you're grateful for. I think that's fine. Do all that stuff. But when you're talking about a very precision performance instrument in professional athletics, when you go overseas and somebody is trying to take your life away from you, it is not trivial to know exactly what you describe, Patty, not only how you feel, but how do the instruments of the job work together? Meaning your teammates, the gear that you use, and no one can remember all that stuff. Like you have to track your performance in some way to know how to make adjustments. Otherwise, back to my point earlier, you can talk about being pretty good, but don't talk about being elite if you're not doing elite behaviors.
I think self-awareness is so much of what underscores that. To me, self-awareness is the foundation of mental toughness. It's like doing land navigation and not knowing the first place you're starting from. Like, how do you get to point B if you don't even know where point A is, where you're currently standing? You can't. And so I think that's that journaling piece. That's that reflection at the end of a game. That's that time to write it down. That's what being elite is, having such a good sense of how you function that then you're able to be agile, then you're able to be flexible, then you're able to adapt and evolve and persist because you know how you function. You know what your strengths and weaknesses are. So you can grab the teammate that helps you cover down on that weakness if that's what you got to attack, or you've got the strength there and you're going to move forward without hesitation. Candid feedback and moments where you get to see yourself clearly, or peer evaluations, or moments alone in the woods are probably the greatest gift we get given because we have to see ourselves. And I just feel like those moments, that's what starts to create the ability to be elite, the ability to succeed.
Yeah, the ability to get better, even if you're not elite, just to be able
learn,
to improve and learn. Like, I think that's why that sniper journal really grabbed me, because I assume, Coleman, you can't be a good sniper if you don't know how your gun works, particularly if it changes how it works in different conditions. And that's what we all do as humans. We naturally, there's a lot of research now that says personality is not fixed. And depending on the situation, depending on your physiology, depending on what's on the line, we are different people, different contexts. And if I don't know that, and I'm just going to pretend that this gun fires the same as it did yesterday because I'm in a different spot, then I'm in real trouble as a human operator. And that's why I think that really grabbed me as a metaphor. We're going to move a little more to a broader view, because not everyone who is listening is going to be someone who holds a gun, potentially. There are a lot of people who might be medical operators, or there may be teachers or instructors, or there's a wide array. But a lot of people are also husbands and wives, and children and uncles and aunts and all sorts of things. And so one of the things that often comes up when I'm having these chats offline, but particularly on the show, is it moves into the realm of like how this spreads, how we can talk about your ability to deal with a gun in different conditions, or your ability to step off a mount and control your physiology. And that somehow seeps into someone's personal life. Do you guys see that in the various crowds that you're working with?
Say more about that, Patty. What do you mean exactly?
So I will often relay the story of one of the first athletes who went all in, I guess, in terms of the stuff that we were doing here. And it took a little bit of convincing, and he saw some results, and then it became his thing, right? His teammates would rib him about it. And eventually he was just like, I don't give a shit because I know when I go home. And I started the conversation that I always reflect on by saying, hey, man, I'm proud of it. Like, your teammates are ribbing you, you're sticking to it. We're seeing like he was having a career best stretch. It was really cool, man. And he was like, yeah, that's kind of cool. But the best part is I'm a better father because of this. And I'm better. Like I guarantee you, my wife will tell you I'm better around her. And that was like, I get speaking of physiology, my hairs are standing up on my arms as I tell that story. But it is a real effect of not always, but sometimes when we work on this stuff, it translates into other areas of life. Is that your experience there?
Yeah, I think so I'll give a simplistic and silly story, and then I'll hit one that's maybe more in line with family. But
simple and silly is great.
Well, so I had a baseball player that was actually at a strength camp in the off season, and they were hitting a lot of the mental stuff, and they were talking about what it takes to really do stuff right consistently, every time making the right decision. And I came out to see the crew at strength camp, and a piece that stuck with me is like, I can't fold laundry without making sure that my socks are properly put together and I have folded them properly and put them away. He's like, I used to not give it about socks, but if you're gonna do it right, do it right. And I actually shared that for something for the Association for Applied Sports Psych. Like I was like, the habits become trends. They generalize into other parts of life. Like this guy's socks now had to be done right too. And that's just where he had gotten to. He was trying to do, if you're going to do it, he was going to do it right. And I thought that was pretty amazing. The other piece that always makes me laugh, particularly when I'm working with instructors and we're talking about like coaching methodologies or feedback or way to do stuff, without fail, one of the first pieces of feedback I get if they go try any of the mental performance stuff is they're like, it worked on my kids. And I'm like, you tried this on your child before you tried it on a soldier? Really? But they did. Yeah, I tried it and it totally worked. And so I always feel like that's kind of that cool moment of like, yes, this stuff tends to universally work. We are dealing with humans here, whether they're a 5-year-old human, which might give you much faster feedback, or whether it's your student that's learning something at 22.
Very cool. Coleman, you have an example?
Oh, yeah, tons. One of the things that I always try to remind myself of, Patty, is the brain's agnostic to your activity. It doesn't know if you're being shot at or if you're being attacked by a great white shark or if you're in a fight with your spouse or girlfriend. The brain follows the physiology and the psychology of the evolution that we have been given. That's it. And so if you are building new mental and physical skills in this realm, in one area, you're going to get seepage, as you guys know, in other areas. And that's not surprising. It's obviously really encouraging. And when I think I have almost 18-year-old son, 15 and 11, three boys. And I was talking with Sean Hulls, who you know, Patty, and we were talking about performance. And Sean was talking about work capacity. Right? And I'll bring this back to parenting, to your point. Sean said, remember, like the acquisition of a skill happens in, I guess, 5 or 6 stages. Let's see. First, you do it slowly, then you do it at speed, then you do it at speed with fatigue. So 5 stages. Then you do it at speed with fatigue under external pressure conditions, and you have to do that consistently. And so when I think about just being a good father and a good spouse, trying to be good at those things and being a good friend to people, you practice the new mental skills slow and then at speed and then at speed and under fatigue and then under fatigue and under pressure, and do that consistently. And I was having a long conversation with my oldest son last night, and not for anything he did wrong, just a long conversation about whatever. And you are invested for a long period of time and you have to do these things consistently over time. And if you run yourself into the red as an athlete or a soldier, your body doesn't just magically perform better when you walk into the house. Like it's in the red for everything. And that's something we have to watch for.
Yeah. So, I love that. There's some great analogies there, which might be your answer to this final question, particularly when it gets to talking about how this affects life. I'm often reminded of a quote from William James, who I think he actually bastardized it from Socrates or Aristotle, but We're just going to say it's William James. And he said, sow a thought, reap an action, sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character, sow a character, reap a life. The basic premise of like how we think affects, or what we focus on affects how we might act in the moment. But if we do that regularly enough, we create habits which essentially form our character or our personality. And if we hold on to that for long enough, it basically dictates how our life's going to end up. And so I'm prompted to think of that because we're talking about how these little acts can seep into other areas of our life because it kind of reshapes the way we handle things. You said it much better though, Coleman, with sexier language, that if you were going to give as a final takeaway, if each of you were going to give one, like here's a thought or here's an act that if you sow this often enough, it'll lead to good habits or the character you might want that'll give you the good life or the type of life you might want to end up with. What's a simple takeaway? It may not be easy, but it could be simple that if applied regularly and consistently could really change someone's toughness, their ability to deal with discomfort. And to your point, Cece, early on, to just like this, to put up with feelings and still do their thing, or Coleman, like you mentioned, to be mentally agile. What's the one thing to pay attention to or something you can do that if you do it often enough, it'll make you better in that area?
Yeah. Cece, I'll give you a second to think here and formulate your answer because I have a couple just because I just prepared some notes here, which was actually, this was designed for earlier, but I think it fits here, Patty, as well. I think of maybe top 2 or 3 questions since I've been out of the military and just moving around the regular world. This thing I'm about to share is one of the top 3 questions I've been asked by literally like every single person I meet who's even mildly interested in talking about my old life in special operations was what you've alluded to here and what this show is really about is like, Coleman, what's your definition of mental toughness? I've been asked that, it seems like 10,000 times. And the way I think about it is, and I can check myself in almost any realm in this environment, when I'm sitting in freezing cold water, when you're overseas, when you are doing something uncomfortable in your house or with your family, it's a situation you don't like, is your desire for mission accomplishment greater than your desire for personal comfort? And when I cop out, when I fail to have a hard conversation with my boys or my wife or a teammate or a friend, or I fail to do something tactically in training and in preparation or overseas, typically it's when I'm deferring to my personal comfort. Coleman wants to feel better physically or emotionally, and that sacrifices an opportunity at accomplishing the objective you're going for. And so insert 6,000 examples in athletics. If I really don't want to run those wind sprints that hard because we've been working hard this week. Okay, don't run them that hard. But remember, the enemy, opponent, whatever, the enemy does not care about your comfort. Their mission in life is to take your comfort away, sometimes permanently. So when you choose your own personal comfort in your training and your preparation and your behavior, you're building a habit that the enemy is more than willing to make you pay for.
The great definition and a very strong example. Cece, you got some thinking time there.
Ooh, that's interesting. My definition for mental toughness was the foundation of self-awareness, but the capability to adapt and persist towards goals. And I kind of love Coleman. So I'm gonna straddle this a little bit. I'm gonna say, if you are currently comfortable enough in life or doing well enough in life, then I would say my piece would be find something that makes you uncomfortable, that gives you butterflies. And learning something new is the easiest way to do it. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. Just doing something where you have to do the research, see what you're like when you're learning, see what you're like when you're challenged, get to know yourself out of autopilot. When we're good at stuff, we're oftentimes in autopilot. So if life is okay right now, get uncomfortable. If life's not okay, if you're struggling or slumping, it's the same advice I'd give a player is, what's one thing that when you're playing well, you do consistently? What's that one strength that you come back to? Hey, when I'm playing well, I always do this, or I'm consistently this person. And then just let that be the bar of success for that moment and do that consistently. I think oftentimes when we're slumping or we're struggling in life, we want to jump out of those moments or get out of them really quickly. And we forget that we have to find our first handhold or our first foothold to start to climb up out of that. And so set that first hand or foothold. And then the hard part on this is to let that be success for a while, is just doing that one piece well and letting go of the net. You know, you're going to have to climb another 8 feet. Forget about the other 8 feet for now. Just do the first one. And what I usually find is that people can focus on that. before they know it, they're climbing way higher than they thought they would. But you got to come back to simple. You can't solve all the problems at once, which half the time what got you in the hole to begin with. So yeah, depending on where you are now, I would have slightly different pieces of advice.
Love it. That's a very nuanced answer that no one has taken the time to split their answer into. So well done. You've set the bar higher now for everyone else. Coleman, I love the definition of mental toughness there, which we sort of skirted past earlier, but that was a very powerful definition. To the point that Ceci ended on, have you got a takeaway or here's something you can do to improve that?
Other than recognize where you start to, so the story I normally tell, Patty, is when I went back to Buds as an instructor. After being a student, I went back as an instructor and watching other students go through. Hell Week is such an easy example because it's so difficult physically and mentally. And surf torture is such a miserable event where you just sit in the water and get frozen. It doesn't teach you a lot, but you can start to recognize for yourself. It's the recognition is, do you recognize those moments where you start to toggle your decision making? Like to Cece's point is like, things are, I'm on autopilot. I don't feel like I'm on autopilot anymore. Do you know when those moments are coming? Because if you work on recognizing when they arrive, what you're starting to do is recognize when your physiology or your training or your psychology or what your life experience has quote unquote, like in a way failed you, but really it's just signaling to you. And that's when you have an opportunity. When you're on autopilot, you're not using any mental agility skills. Like it's when you start to waver a little bit on something that, and so that I think something we can do, look, for any listener, forget practice, forget a game. If you're professional, forget a deployment. In a regular day, catch yourself, recognize places where you don't feel like, for lack of a better term, like you just don't know exactly what to do and have the right answer. Like, why am I a little bit like uncertain about this? And just observe how many times in a day you are toggling in this uncertain position. That's mental toughness. Like there's no magic fairy dust. Like for other people, it just happens to be different phases, right? A player like Steph Curry or LeBron James, they don't toggle till ever in the playoffs, right? But everybody has their own range, but you have to know when you're toggling. Otherwise, you're guessing.
Yeah. And also, it's like great examples there of guys who may not, in a certain niche, in a certain arena, may not toggle. Like you've mastered that shit. But at home, you toggle when the baby starts crying. Like it's important to be able to spread your awareness because you can develop it in any arena. As you were talking about being able to get to that point where you toggle, I was reminded of a quote I saw on an Insta account today, which I'm not proud of sharing this because it's not something I normally do. But the quote said, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. That's a little bit airy-fairy, but I'm going to twist it a little bit about growth begins at the end of your comfort zone. And in particular, growing mental toughness or mental agility is like you just have to get to the point where you toggle out of comfort, where you lose a little bit of control. That's where you can start to stretch those areas, same as you do physically. Until your heart starts beating, you're not really training.
Yeah. I mean, when we're younger, right, we don't like for the coach or the parent or the teacher or the administrator or whoever, let's just use athletics because it's an easier example because that more people have played childhood athletics than they have done military. So the first time the coach gives you some feedback you don't like, you're toggling. Make no mistake. You're like, I don't like the way he's talking to me. I think I was doing that right. But that is a great example of the encouragement that I always share is when you just don't like the situation you're in, that's when you're toggling. And that's when you have to get much more curious, less certainty, more inquiry. Just ask yourself, slow down for a second and ask yourself, why don't I like this? And do I need to do something to get better? Because otherwise you are going to resist your own future potential at being elite because you just don't like the way the situation's unfolding. That's mental toughness. Like it isn't, I can do 1,000 push-ups. It isn't, I can throw a perfect game in Major League Baseball. Like we all, as you've brought up here, Patty, we have long and complicated lives that they're not always in Major League Baseball in the military, right? There's situations all the time that I think we can recognize that.
Love that. That's a pretty good note to end on there. And I want to say thank you to both of you for making time to come on here. Obviously, this is a topic that's close to both of your hearts and it's going to help a lot of people, and specifically sharing the experiences that many of our listeners may not have had yet, but hopefully you're helping them prep. For those who want to find you after the episode, find either the other work that you do or get in contact, what's the best way for someone to find you?
I am on Twitter as Edge Mentality, and that's probably the easiest way to find me.
Perfect. I'll put a link under this episode. And Coleman, I'll share with others. You've heard both Ceci and Coleman mention the MCTI podcast. So the Mission Critical Teams Initiative has its own podcast, which is much better and has much smoother vocals than this one. So if you want to tune into that, I'll put a link at the bottom of this as well. You can probably just search MCTI podcast. Is there any other way, if someone wants to get in contact with you directly, Colin, what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, a couple. So thanks for the plug, Patty. The Teamcast, if you search Teamcast on Spotify or Apple, it'll come right up. And then the missioncti.com website, you can get to Preston and I. You can get the episodes and all that kind of stuff. And some of the papers, research we post like things that are coming up next, summits and things that you guys have been to. And that's pretty much it. Or if people have direct contact with Cease or you, Patty, you can share my email, or I don't share my email openly on venues like this, but I'm a pretty wide open guy. Like I don't hide from the general public.
Perfect. I'll add links to all of those things underneath the episode. And I'm going to say, because I love this so much and I love you two operators and as people, that the number of links below an episode shows how cool the people are, because you guys are going to have the most links so far. So that's just a little observation we've got so far. I want to say thanks again. Appreciate your time. And hopefully it's not too long before we talk again soon.